Thomas Jefferson was one of the most prolific figures of the Revolutionary period. He was a writer, an author, an inventor, a politician, and so much more. And probably one of the most famous things that he did, of course, was to pen the words of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the words that would rally the American colonists behind the cause of the American Revolution and to fight against the injustices imposed upon them by England. But when you view these words in the light of slavery and race, it's almost a bit hypocritical, especially when you talk about Jefferson's views of slavery. He had really contradictory views. For most of his career, he advocated for the abolition of slavery. He was actively involved in legislation that he wanted to result in the end of slavery. In fact, in the original version of his Declaration of Independence, he actually wrote that slavery was a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberties. Of course, this was taken out of the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. But it speaks a lot to what Jefferson thought about the institution of slavery. In 1778, he was instrumental in drafting a Virginia law that prohibited the import of enslaved Africans. Of course, this didn't stop the slave trade, it just stopped Virginians from being able to bring in new slaves from Africa. In 1784, he proposed an ordinance that would ban slavery in the Northwest Territories. He also advocated a plan for a gradual end to the institution of slavery. First, he thought it was important to end the transatlantic slave trade. Then he wanted slave owners to improve conditions in their living facilities, in the food that they were given, their workload, and also to moderate the amount of physical punishment that was doled out to the slaves. Finally, he would create a point in which any slave born after this date would be considered free, and then eventually there would be the total abolition of all slaves. Now, while he held these views and did fight for the end of slavery, he himself was a slave owner. In fact, during his lifetime, he would own over 600 slaves. And of those more than 600 slaves, he only freed 7. And those 7 were all members of the Hemmings family, which of course the Hemmings family is famous, a famous slave family that Jefferson owned, probably because of his affair with Sally Hemings. And of course historians believe that he fathered at least one child with Sally Hemings. But it was only her family members that he freed. And the reason that he didn't free his slaves was because he believed that white Americans and black slaves could not live together peacefully in the same country. In fact, he believed that blacks were inferior to the whites. Later in a letter to Benjamin Banneker, he admitted that this inferiority was due to the fact that they were enslaved and the treatment that they received while enslaved, but he did believe that the blacks were inferior. And then he believed that when you couple the inferiority with the fact that they would resent their former masters, it was just too dangerous to free slaves. His famous quote about slavery is that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. So it seems that there's this contradictory tone when it comes to the issue of slavery for Thomas Jefferson. And to me it's kind of fascinating because the same man who could pen the words that all men are created equal could himself be a slave owner. Jefferson no doubt recognized that slavery was evil And he even fought for the abolition of the institution of slavery. But he himself remained tied to this system, freeing barely any of his own slaves. And I know it would be a little unfair to judge him through the lens of modern times and modern thinking, because the times that he lived in were drastically different from our own. But for all that he was able to accomplish, and for all that Thomas Jefferson did and was, his views and the way he handled the issue of slavery in his own personal life is kind of a blight on his legacy. The fact that he remained a slave owner until his death and never freed his slaves, that is a blight, I think, on his legacy. Thomas Jefferson was still a great man, and he was still amazingly influential in the formation of the United States. So he is a great man and a great leader. I wish he would have freed his slaves, though.